Hoy te voy a contar una historia tan tensa y brutal que dejó al oeste en completo silencio. En una calle cubierta de polvo, donde el viento arrastraba amenazas y las manos nunca se alejaban del revólver. Ese era un lugar donde la fama mataba más rápido que las balas y donde el destino cruzaba a los hombres sin pedir permiso. Todo empezó por una comida sencilla y una mirada que no llegó, un detalle mínimo que desató una lección imposible de olvidar. Antes de comenzar esta aventura, no olvides darle a me gusta al video y dejarnos saber en los comentarios desde dónde lo estás viendo. Speed without wisdom is just noise before the silence. That's what my grandfather used to say, and I never understood it until the day I witnessed what happened on that dusty street in Razor's Bend back in the spring of 1877. Some lessons in life come gentle like morning rain on prairie grass. Others come hard and fast like a bullet finding its mark. The story I'm about to tell you, it's about the second kind, the kind that changes everything, and the time it takes for a heart to beat one last time. They say pride comes before a fall, but on that particular day, pride came before something far worse. It was the kind of day that starts quiet and ends with the whole territory talking. The kind of day that separates the living from the dead with nothing more than a fraction of a second and a choice made in anger. I was there, standing on that very balcony above Razor's Cover Saloon, watching with my own two eyes. I saw the crowd gather, heard the whispers turn to gasps, felt that terrible stillness that falls over a town when violence is about to break loose like a storm. And I saw him, that old drifter with the weathered face and tired eyes, standing there in his poncho, while the fastest gun and 3 territories pointed a piece of polished steel right at his heart. What happened next? Well, that's why you're listening. That's why this story has been told and retold around campfires from here to Montana. So settle in, pour yourself some coffee, and let me tell you about the day Jake Hollister learned the hardest lesson of his life. Before we get to the twist, like the video if you're enjoying the story. And if you're not subscribed yet, fix that now. Comment your country below. I love seeing these tales reach the whole world. Now stay with me. The next scene will hit hard. The morning started peaceful enough in Razor's Bend, Arizona territory. I remember because I was sweeping the boardwalk outside my general store when the stranger rode in on a paint horse that had seen better days. The animal's coat was dusty, its ribs showing slightly beneath the saddle, and it moved with the careful gait of a horse that had traveled far too many miles without proper rest. But it was the rider who caught my attention. He was old, maybe 65, maybe 70. Hard to tell with men who'd spent their lives under the western sun. His face was deeply lined, weathered like old leather left too long in the elements. His poncho was faded to an indeterminate color somewhere between brown and gray, patched in several places with different fabrics that told the story of a man who made do with what he had. His hat carried the dust of 1,000 miles, the brim bent and shaped by years of sun and rain. His boots were worn down at the heels, the leather cracked and creased but well maintained, regularly oiled despite their age. What struck me most about him was the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, like a man who'd learned that rushing only gets you to the grave faster. There was a kind of careful dignity in the way he dismounted and how he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the Razor's Cover Saloon. In the way he loosened the saddle cinch to give the animal some relief without fully unsettling it. These were the actions of a man who understood horses, who respected them, who knew that a good mount could mean the difference between life and death in this country. He patted the paint's neck, spoke to it in a voice too low for me to hear, and then walked into the saloon without a word to anyone. His spurs didn't jingle the way most men's did. They were wrapped with leather strips to muffle the sound, the mark of someone who'd learned to move quiet when he needed to. That detail stuck with me, though I didn't know why at the time. That should have been the end of it, just another drifter passing through our little town, looking for a meal in a bed before moving on to wherever men like that go. when they're too old for the hard life, but too restless to settle down. Razor's Bend saw plenty of such men. We were on a minor stage route, had a decent hotel, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a doctor. We were the kind of place men stopped at on their way to somewhere else, rarely a destination in ourselves. But fate, as it often does, had other plans that day. About an hour later, just as the sun was reaching its zenith, and the heat was starting to build in that particular way it does in Arizona territory, Jake Hollister rode into town. Now, if you didn't know Jake Hollister, you were either new to the territory or you'd been living under a rock somewhere up in the mountains. Jake Hollister was 28 years old and already had a reputation that stretched from the Rio Grande to the Canadian border. They said he'd killed 17 men in fair fights, though some whispered the number was higher if you counted the ones that weren't quite so fair. They said he could draw on fire before most men could blink, that he practiced 6 hours a day, every day, rain or shine, until his hands moved faster than thought. They said he'd beaten every gun hand who'd ever challenged him, left them bleeding in the dust of a dozen different towns. More than that, though, Jake had developed a mean streak that came from never losing. It's a peculiar thing that happens to some men when they discover they're better than everyone else at something. Instead of that skill bringing humility or responsibility, it brings arrogance. It brings cruelty. Jake had taken to challenging men just to prove he could beat them, just to see the fear in their eyes before the smoke cleared, just to add another story to his growing legend. He wore black from head to toe, and not the practical black of a working cowboy. This was expensive black, tailored in San Francisco, brought back on the stage. Black shirt with silver conchos, black vest with more silver trim, black trousers tucked into polished black boots with silver spurs that jangled with every step. His gun belt was black leather with silver buckles, and the twin revolvers he carried had ivory handles carved with his initials. He wore a black hat with a silver band, and his black horse wore a saddle with silver trim that probably cost more than most men earned in a year. Everything about Jake Hollister was designed to draw attention, to announce his presence, to make people look and fear and remember. He had cold blue eyes that never seemed to blink, a thin mustache that he kept carefully trimmed, and a smile that never reached those eyes. That smile was the worst part, actually. It was the smile of a cat playing with a mouse, the smile of someone who enjoyed other people's fear, who drew pleasure from their discomfort. When Jake dismounted in front of the saloon that day, his spurs jangling loud enough to wake the dead, we all knew trouble was coming. It always did when Jake came to town. He'd been here twice before, both times leaving some poor fool humiliated or injured, once leaving a man dead after a fight over a card game that everyone knew Jake had provoked. The territorial marshal had investigated. Witnesses had sworn it was self-defense, and Jake had ridden away free as a bird. His legend grown a little larger, his reputation a little darker. Inside the saloon, the old drifter had ordered a whiskey and a plate of beans. The barkeep, Charlie Morrison, told me later that the stranger had been polite, soft-spoken, and hadn't caused any fuss. He'd complimented the quality of the whiskey, paid for his meal up front with silver coins that he counted out careful-like from a worn leather pouch, and asked about the price of a room for the night. When Charlie quoted him 50 cents, the stranger had nodded and said he'd take it, counting out another 50 cents and sliding it across the bar. Charlie said the old man had a way of eating that suggested he didn't take food for granted. He ate slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite like it might be his last. He broke his cornbread into small pieces and soaked them in the bean juice. He drank his whiskey in small sips rather than throwing it back. Between bites, he'd rest his fork and just sit there, seeming to appreciate the simple fact of being indoors, out of the sun, with hot food and cold whiskey. He'd chosen a corner table, the one with a view of both the door and the back entrance, the one with a wall at his back. That was another detail that should have told us something, but most folks didn't notice. A man doesn't automatically sit with his back to a wall unless he spent years needing to see danger coming. A man doesn't check the exits unless he's used to planning his escape routes. But like I said, most folks didn't notice such things. The stranger seemed content to spend the afternoon in that corner, maybe have another whiskey, maybe play a hand or two of solitaire with the worn deck of cards he pulled from his vest pocket. He seemed like a man who'd learned to be comfortable with his own company, who didn't need conversation or excitement to feel alive. In a saloon that usually buzzed with talk and laughter and the sounds of men being men, his quiet presence was almost soothing. Then Jake Hollister walked through those swinging doors and everything changed. The piano player, old Willie Thompson, who'd been banging out a rendition of "Oh, Susanna," stopped mid-song, his hands frozen above the keys. Conversations died like candle flames in a strong wind. Men who'd been standing at the bar suddenly found reasons to sit down, to make themselves smaller, less noticeable. The three cowboys who'd been playing poker in the corner gathered up their cards without being told and moved to a different table, further from wherever Jake might choose to stand. Everyone knew what Jake's presence meant. Everyone had seen it before or heard the stories. He was looking for entertainment, and in Jake Hollister's world, entertainment meant humiliation or death. Someone was going to suffer today. Someone was going to be the story he told in the next town, the next notch on his gun, the next addition to his legend. The only question was who? Jake's spurs jingled as he walked to the bar, each step deliberate, measured, designed to draw every eye in the room. He didn't just walk, he performed, like an actor on a stage who knows the audience is watching. He hooked one boot on the brass rail at the bottom of the bar, leaned his elbow on the polished wood, and smiled at Charlie Morrison with that cold, humorless smile. "Whiskey," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "The good stuff, not the rot gut you serve the locals." Charlie, his hands shaking slightly, pulled out a bottle of Kentucky bourbon that he kept for special occasions and poured Jake a generous glass. Jake picked it up, held it to the light, examined its color like he was some kind of connoisseur, then knocked it back in one swallow. He set the glass down hard enough to make a sharp crack against the bar. "Another?" he said. And Charlie poured with hands that shook a little more. Jake took the second drink more slowly, turning to survey the room over the rim of his glass. His eyes swept across the familiar faces, the regular customers who'd suddenly become very interested in their own drinks, their own cards, their own boots, anything but meeting Jake Hollister's gaze. Then his eyes settled on the old man in the corner. The stranger was still eating his beans methodically, peacefully, as if the most dangerous man in 3 territories hadn't just walked into the room. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge Jake's presence, didn't show any sign of fear or even interest. He just kept eating, his fork moving from plate to mouth with the same steady rhythm it had maintained before. That simple act of ignoring Jake Hollister was probably the most dangerous thing anyone in that room had done in months. Charlie Morrison saw it. I heard about it later from 3 different sources, and they all said the same thing. They saw Jake's face change, saw something dark and ugly flash across those cold blue eyes. Jake Hollister was used to many reactions. Fear, certainly. Respect always. Even hatred sometimes. But indifference, being ignored, that was something new. Something intolerable. Jake finished his second drink and set the glass down, this time gently, with a kind of ominous care. He straightened up from the bar, adjusted his gun belt with both hands in that particular way gunfighters have, making sure everything is positioned exactly right, making sure the draw will be smooth and fast when the time comes. Then he walked toward the corner table, his spurs jingling with each step, creating a rhythm that sounded almost like a death march. The old man finally looked up from his beans, not startled, not afraid, just looking up the way you might if someone had called your name from across the room. His weathered face showed no emotion, just a kind of patient curiosity, like he was waiting to see what would happen next, but wasn't particularly concerned about it. Jake stopped at the table and stood there, looking down at the old man, waiting for some reaction, some sign of fear or respect. When none came, When the stranger just sat there looking up at him with those calm, tired eyes, Jake's jaw tightened. His hand moved to rest on the ivory handle of his right handgun, not drawing, just resting there, a clear threat that everyone in the room understood. "You know who I am, old man." Jake's voice carried that particular edge that men get when their pride has been pricked, when they're looking for an excuse to turn annoyance into violence. The stranger took another spoonful of beans, chewed slowly, swallowed, took a sip of whiskey, and then looked up at Jake with eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by shows of bravado. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, with a slight rasp that suggested years of tobacco or too many nights sleeping in cold camps. "Can't say I do, son," he said simply, and then returned his attention to his plate. That one word, son, seemed to light a fire in Jake's belly. I heard later from Charlie that Jake's face actually went red beneath his tan, that his hand tightened on his gun, that for a moment, everyone in the saloon thought the shooting was about to start right there at the table. But Jake had enough self-control, or maybe enough showmanship to want to draw this out, to make it last, to extract maximum entertainment from the situation. "Name's Jake Hollister," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I've killed 17 men in fair fights. Every one of them thought they were fast until they faced me. Every one of them died, knowing they weren't fast enough." The old man nodded slowly, as if considering this information, weighing it, measuring it against some internal standard that only he understood. His expression didn't change, didn't show fear or admiration or anything, really. He just nodded, and then spoke again in that same quiet, gentle voice. "That's a heavy burden to carry," he said, looking directly into Jake's eyes. "All those ghosts following a man around must make for lonely nights and troubled sleep." Jake's hand moved to grip his gun tighter, his knuckles going white around the ivory handle. Around the room, men were starting to edge toward the doors, not wanting to be present when the inevitable explosion came. Charlie Morrison had moved to the far end of the bar, ready to duck behind it when the shooting started. Willie Thompson had quietly left his piano bench and was standing near the back door, poised to run. "You trying to be funny, old-timer?" Jake's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried through the entire room. "You trying to disrespect me?" The stranger shook his head slowly, his expression still calm, still patient, like a teacher dealing with a difficult student. "No, son, just stating a fact." Jake pulled out the chair across from the old man and sat down hard, his hand never moving far from his gun. He leaned forward across the table, invading the stranger's space, trying to intimidate through proximity what he couldn't intimidate through reputation. Up close, Jake could see the deep lines in the old man's face, the sun damage and wind burn of decades spent outdoors, the scars that marked a life lived hard. But what he couldn't see, what he was looking for and failing to find, was fear. "Let me tell you something, Drifter," Jake said, his voice low and mean. "I didn't come in here looking for a philosophy lesson from some broken-down old man who probably never drew on anything more dangerous than a whiskey bottle. I came in looking for some fun, and you're it. You're going to be the story I tell in the next town, the example I make of what happens when somebody disrespects Jake Hollister." The old man sat down his spoon with a soft clink against the tin plate inside, a deep, weary sigh that seemed to carry years of exhaustion and resignation. He pushed his plate away, the beans only half eaten, the cornbread unfinished. When he looked at Jake this time, there was something in his eyes that might have been pity or sadness, or maybe just tired acceptance of the way young fools repeat the mistakes of all the young fools who came before them. "I'm just trying to eat my beans in peace, young man," the stranger said quietly. "I don't want any trouble. I didn't come here looking for a fight. I'm just passing through, trying to mind my own business and hurt nobody." "Why can't you let that be enough?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it, just a harsh, brittle sound like breaking glass. "See, that's where you're wrong, old man. You don't get to decide if there's trouble. I decide. I'm Jake Hollister. And when I walk into a room, I'm the one who decides how things are going to go. And I've decided that you and me are going to step outside and settle this like men." The old man was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands resting flat on the table. Those calm eyes studying Jake's face like he was trying to see past the bravado and the cruelty to whatever might be underneath. When he finally spoke, his voice was even quieter than before, almost gentle, the way you might talk to a horse that's about to bolt. "Settle what exactly?" "I haven't done anything to you. I don't even know you. I called you son out of habit, out of respect for someone younger than me. I didn't look up when you came in because I learned a long time ago that not noticing trouble is sometimes the best way to avoid it. What have I done that deserves a bullet?" Jake leaned even closer, his face now just inches from the old man's, his breath probably reeking of whiskey and anger. "You disrespected me. You sat there like I don't matter. Like Jake Hollister is just another cowboy passing through. You called me son like I'm some kind of child who needs instruction. You're sitting here acting like you're better than me, like you're above it all, like you've got nothing to prove. Well, I'm here to show you different. I'm here to show you and everyone in this room what happens to people who don't give Jake Hollister his due." The stranger closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering patience or strength, or maybe just accepting the inevitable. When he opened them again, there was a kind of sad resignation there. The look of a man who's seen this play out too many times before, who knows how it ends, who wishes it could be different, but understands that wishing doesn't change reality. "And if I refuse?" he asked quietly. "If I just finish my beans, pay for my room, and ride out in the morning without ever stepping outside with you?" Jake's smile was cruel, predatory, the smile of a man who knows he's got his prey cornered with no way out. "Then I'll shoot you right here at this table, and everyone will know you died a coward. They'll know that you were so afraid of Jake Hollister that you wouldn't even face him like a man. Your name, whatever it is, will be a joke in every saloon from here to El Paso. Remember that old coward who got shot eating beans? That's what they'll say. That's your legacy if you don't walk outside with me." The room had gone so quiet you could hear the flies buzzing against the window glass, could hear the creak of the floorboards as men shifted their weight, could hear someone's nervous breathing from across the room. Everyone was waiting, watching, witnessing. This was the moment. This was where the old man would either beg for mercy, which would be entertaining in its own way, or where he'd accept the challenge and give everyone a show before he died. The old man looked down at his half-eaten plate of beans, at the glass of whiskey with just a swallow left in it, at the simple meal he'd been enjoying before violence came calling. Then he looked back at Jake, and something had changed in his eyes. They were still calm, still steady, but there was something else there now. Something harder. Something that had been sleeping, but was now awake. It was the look of a man who's made a decision, who's accepted what has to be done even though he doesn't want to do it. He stood up slowly, his joints seeming to protest the movement, that old poncho settling around his shoulders as he rose to his full height. He was shorter than Jake, older, clearly worn down by life and miles and years. But there was a dignity in the way he stood, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with size or youth. "I'll face you," the old man said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent saloon despite its softness. "But I want everyone here to witness that I didn't want this. I want them to remember that I tried to avoid it, that you forced this on me, that I would have ridden out of here tomorrow without incident if you'd just let me be. I want it known that this blood, whoever it turns out to be, is on your hands, not mine." Jake stood up fast, his chair scraping loud against the wooden floor, the sound like a gunshot in the tense silence. He was grinning now, that cruel smile spreading across his face like he'd just won a bet or heard a particularly good joke. This was what he'd wanted, what he'd come for. Another man to humble, another story to tell, Another notch on his reputation. "Sure, old-timer," Jake said, spreading his arms wide in a mockery of generosity. "Everyone here will remember. They'll remember the day Jake Hollister put down another man who thought he was tough. They'll remember you standing out there in the street shaking in your boots, trying to draw that old gun before I put a bullet in your chest. That's what they'll remember." The stranger shook his head slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a strange certainty, almost like he could see the future and knew something Jake didn't. "That's not what they'll remember, but you'll find that out soon enough." They walked toward the door, Jake strutting like a rooster, his spurs jingling, his hands hovering near his guns, already playing to the crowd that was forming. The old man just walked, steady and slow, like he was heading out to check on his horse or watch a sunset. Like this was just another thing that had to be done in a long life full of things that had to be done. We all followed, pouring out onto the street, taking positions on the boardwalk and the balcony above the saloon. Word spread fast in a small town, and within minutes it seemed like every soul in Razor's Bend had gathered to watch. Shop owners left their stores, the blacksmith abandoned his forge, children were pulled inside by worried mothers, and men positioned themselves where they'd have a clear view but hopefully be out of the line of fire if things went wrong. I found myself on that balcony above the saloon, looking down at the dusty street where two men stood in the afternoon sun. The light was harsh, casting sharp shadows, making everything look stark and unforgiving. A hot wind blew down the street, kicking up little dust devils, carrying the smell of horse manure and dry earth and something else, something like electricity before a storm, the scent of violence about to break loose. Jake positioned himself in the middle of the street, making a show of it, adjusting his gun belt with exaggerated care, flexing his fingers, rolling his shoulders like a boxer preparing for a fight. He was playing to the crowd, making sure everyone had time to gather, making sure this moment would be remembered and retold. About 20 paces away, the old stranger simply stood there, his arms hanging loose at his sides, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his worn hat. He wasn't posing, wasn't preparing, just standing there like he was waiting for a stage or watching clouds pass by. "You got a gun, old man?" Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly through the tense silence that had fallen over the crowd. "Because I don't shoot unarmed men. I'm not a murderer, just a man who's faster than everyone else." The stranger nodded once. "I do? Good." Jake said, that cruel smile still on his face. "Good. Because when this is over, I want everyone to know you had a chance. I want them to know this was fair, that you were armed, that you could have drawn if you were fast enough. When you're ready, old man, reach for it. I'll give you that much. I'll let you go first. I'll give you a head start, just to make it sporting." The old man didn't move, didn't reach for his gun, didn't change his stance or his expression. He just stood there in that same patient, waiting way, like time meant nothing to him, like he could stand there all day if need be. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but clear. "I said I'd face you. I didn't say I'd draw first. If you're determined to kill me, if you're set on this course, then you'll have to be the one to start it. You'll have to be the one who draws first on an old man who did nothing to you. That's how it'll have to be." Jake's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, something like frustration crossed his face. This wasn't going the way he wanted. He wanted fear. He wanted begging. He wanted the old man to give him some kind of justification, some excuse that would make this feel righteous instead of just cruel. He wanted to be able to tell the story later and make himself sound like he'd been challenged, like he'd been defending himself for his honor. Instead, he was getting quiet dignity, calm acceptance, and a kind of sorrowful wisdom that was somehow more unsettling than any show of fear could have been. The old man was making Jake be the villain in this story, was making sure everyone watching would know exactly what this was. Bullying, pure and simple. A young, strong man forcing an old, tired one to fight because he could, because he wanted to, because it fed something dark and hungry in his soul, Fine, Jake spat, his voice tight with anger that had nowhere to go but toward violence. Fine, old man. I'll draw first, Jake continued, his voice getting louder, more forceful, trying to regain control of the narrative, trying to make this something other than what it clearly was. But when I do, you better reach for that gun, old-timer, or I'll make sure everyone knows you died without even trying. I'll make sure the story is that you froze, that you were too scared to even draw, that Jake Hollister faced down a coward who just stood there and took his bullet like a sheep going to slaughter. The stranger's expression didn't change, but he nodded slowly. I'll defend myself when you draw on me. That's all I can promise. If you start this, I'll do what I have to do. But I won't be the one who starts it. That's on you. The crowd had gone completely silent now. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then went quiet, as if even the animals could sense the tension in the air. On the balcony where I stood, men were gripping the railing, leaning forward, not wanting to miss what was about to happen. Behind windows, I could see faces pressed against the glass, women and children watching despite themselves, unable to look away from the terrible theater playing out in the street. Jake's hand tensed, hovering over his gun. His face had gone hard, all the performative smile gone now, replaced by cold concentration, and something that might have been anger at being forced into the role of villain. He'd wanted this to be different, wanted to be able to justify it somehow. But the old man had taken that away from him with his quiet dignity and his refusal to be anything other than what he was, an innocent man being forced into violence. So be it, Jake said, and his hand dropped toward his gun. I've seen fast men in my time. I've seen gunfighters who could clear leather quicker than thought, who moved with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. I'd seen Jake Hollister himself draw twice before, had marveled at how his hand moved, how the gun appeared in it like magic, how the hammer came back and the barrel came level all in one smooth, impossibly fast motion. But I'd never seen anything as fast as Jake Hollister drew that day. Maybe it was anger driving him. Maybe it was the desire to end this quickly, to finish the old man before he could even react, to make this death as quick and clean as possible so he could move past the uncomfortable feeling the stranger's words had created. Whatever the reason, Jake's draw was lightning, was thunder, was faster than anything human should be able to move. His hand flashed down, grabbed the ivory handle, pulled the revolver free of the holster, brought it up in a perfect arc, the hammer already cocked, the barrel swinging toward the old man's chest. It should have been over. In any reasonable world, with any normal man standing 20 paces away, it would have been over. Jake's gun was coming level. His finger was tightening on the trigger, and the old stranger was still just standing there with his arms at his sides. Another second, maybe less, and a bullet would tear through the old man's chest, and Jake Hollister would have his 18th kill, his newest story, his latest proof that he was the fastest gun in 3 territories. But something happened that I still see in my dreams, that I'll see until the day I die. As Jake's gun came level, as his finger began its final squeeze on the trigger, the old man moved. And when I say moved, I don't mean he drew fast. I don't mean he was quick. I mean something that seemed to exist outside of normal time, outside of normal physics, outside of everything I thought I understood about how fast a human being could move. It wasn't a fast draw. It was faster than that. It was like the old man could see the future, could see where Jake's gun would be before it got there, was already moving to meet it, already responding to something that hadn't quite happened yet. His hand moved with a terrible certainty. No wasted motion, no flourish, no show. Just pure efficiency, born of years and experience, and something deeper than speed, something more fundamental than quick reflexes. The old man's gun seemed to appear in his hand like magic, like it had always been there and we just hadn't noticed. There was no show, no flash, no dramatic sweep of his arm, just a worn revolver that came up smooth and steady and impossibly fast. His draw was so economical, so efficient, that it looked almost lazy, like he was moving in slow motion while everyone else was frozen. But that's the thing about true speed. It often looks effortless, looks easy because there's no wasted energy, no unnecessary movement, just the minimum required motion to open. The old man's gun came level just as Jake's finger completed its pull on the trigger. 2 hammers fell, 2 firing pins struck primers, 2 explosions of gunpowder sent 2 bullets speeding down 2 barrels at supersonic velocity. But the old man had started his motion a fraction of a second after Jake. And somehow, impossibly, his bullet left the barrel first. Bang! The sound echoed through the street like thunder, like the sky splitting open, like the earth itself crying out. It was the loudest sound I'd ever heard, or maybe it just seemed that way because of the terrible silence that had preceded it. Birds exploded from the roofs of buildings, horses shied at their hitching posts, and in the street, Jake Hollister, the fastest gun in 3 territories, the man who'd killed 17 others in fair fights, stood there with his gun only half aimed, a look of complete shock spreading across his face. His own shot went wild, the bullet kicking up dust 3 feet to the left of the old man, the sound of his gunshot coming a split second after the stranger's, confirming what our eyes were telling us, but our minds couldn't quite believe. The old drifter had been faster, impossibly, incredibly, unbelievably faster. Jake staggered, his gun falling from his hand, both hands now clutching his right shoulder where blood was already beginning to seep between his fingers. His face had gone white, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, and perhaps, for the first time in years, real fear. He took another stumbling step backward, and then fell to his knees in the dust, raising little clouds that hung in the still air like smoke. The old man stood there for a moment, his gun still level, still aimed, making sure Jake wasn't going to try to go for his second revolver with his left hand. Only when it was clear that Jake was done, that the fight was over, did the stranger slowly, carefully lower his gun. He didn't holster it immediately, keeping it in his hand, but pointed at the ground, ready if needed, but no longer threatening. Then he walked forward, his steps steady and measured, no hurry, no triumph, just a man doing what needed to be done next. He stopped a few feet from Jake and looked down at the wounded gunfighter with an expression that wasn't angry or victorious, just sad. Deeply, profoundly sad. Like he'd seen this scene play out too many times before. Like he'd hoped never to see it again, but had known somehow that he would. "You'll live," the old man said quietly, his voice carrying in the silence that had fallen over the street. The bullet went clean through, didn't hit bone, didn't hit anything vital. "You'll have the use of that arm again in a few months, though it'll pain you some in cold weather. You'll have a scar to remember this day by, but you'll live." Jake was gasping, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how the world had turned upside down so completely. His breathing was ragged, part pain and part shock, and when he looked up at the old man, his eyes held none of their former arrogance, none of their cruel confidence. They were just the eyes of a young man who'd been hurt and was trying to understand how and why. "Who?" Jake managed to gasp out. "Who are you?" The old man was quiet for a long moment, as if debating whether to answer, whether this young fool deserved to know. Then he spoke, and his words carried to every person gathered on that street, to everyone watching from balconies and windows, to everyone who would tell this story in the years to come. "Name's Thomas Carver," he said simply. "Used to marshal up in Abilene, back before you were born, back when Kansas was still wild and the railroad was just coming through." The name hit the crowd like a physical force, like a thunderclap, like the ground shifting beneath our feet. Thomas Carver. Even I knew that name, and I was just a shopkeeper who'd never been more than 100 miles from Razor's Bend. Every person over 40 in that crowd knew it. Thomas Carver had been a legend, one of the greatest lawmen the West had ever seen. A name spoken in the same breath as Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp. a man whose exploits had been written about in dime novels and newspaper articles from New York to San Francisco. They said Thomas Carver had cleaned up Abilene when it was the wildest town in Kansas, when the cattle drives brought thousands of cowboys with 6 months' pay, in a thirst for whiskey and trouble. They said he'd faced down the Dalton gang alone when they tried to rob the Abilene Bank in 1871, had killed 2 of them and wounded 3 others without taking a scratch himself. They said he'd tracked a killer through a blizzard for 3 days and brought him back alive for trial. They said he'd never killed a man who didn't draw first, never took a life unless there was absolutely no other choice, had talked down more confrontations than he'd shot his way out of. They also said he'd disappeared about 15 years back, just hung up his guns and walked away from it all. Some rumors said he'd gone north, maybe to Montana Territory, maybe all the way to Canada. Other rumors said he'd died quietly somewhere, that the famous Thomas Carver had passed away unknown and unmoored. But most people figured he was just trying to live quiet, trying to escape the legend he'd built, trying to find some peace after years of violence and death and the weight of that badge. And here he was, standing in our dusty street, looking down at Jake Hollister with those sad, tired eyes. Here was the legend, old and worn and dressed in a faded poncho, just trying to eat his beans in peace before being forced to prove he still had it. That the years and the miles hadn't taken everything from him, that when pushed, he could still be Thomas Carver, the fastest gun in Kansas Territory. Jake was staring up at him like he'd seen a ghost, like the ground had opened up and revealed something impossible. "You're Thomas Carver." His voice was hoarse, shock and pain mixing together. The Thomas Carver, the marshal from Abilene. Thomas nodded slowly. Was. "I gave that life up a long time ago. Been trying to live peaceful, trying to atone for all the violence I was part of, even the justified violence. Been trying to put distance between me and Thomas Carver, the marshal, trying to just be Thomas Carver, the man. That's why I didn't want this fight, son. Not because I was afraid, not because I couldn't do it, but because I'm tired of it." Thomas looked around at all of us watching, at the crowd that had gathered to see Jake Hollister gun down another victim, at the faces now frozen in shock and awe. When he spoke, his voice was tired, but clear, carrying to everyone present, making sure they all heard what needed to be said. "I knew what you were the moment you walked into that saloon," Thomas said, looking back down at Jake. "I've seen 100 Jake Hollisters in my time. Fast guns with something to prove. Young men who think speed is the same thing as strength, who think killing makes them men. I was hoping if I just stayed quiet, just minded my business, just ate my beans and moved on tomorrow, you'd leave me be. I was hoping you'd find some other entertainment, some other way to prove whatever it is you think you need to prove." He holstered his gun finally, the worn leather of his holster creaking slightly, the motions smooth and practiced even after all these years. "But you couldn't do that, could you? You had to push, had to prove you were the fastest, had to show everyone in this town that Jake Hollister doesn't take disrespect from anyone, not even a tired old man just trying to pass through." Thomas reached down with his weathered hand and helped Jake to his feet. The gesture surprised everyone, especially Jake, who flinched at first as if expecting another blow. But Thomas's grip was firm and steady, pulling Jake up despite the younger man's injured shoulder, despite the blood staining his expensive black shirt. "Come on," Thomas said. "Let's get you to the doctor. That shoulder needs tending, needs cleaning and bandaging before infection sets in. You're lucky it's your right shoulder and not your left. Means you'll still have a good arm while the right one heals. Means you can still work, still earn your keep, still do something useful while you think about what happened here today." They walked slowly toward Doc Harrison's office, Thomas supporting Jake with one arm, the old marshal's strength surprising in a man his age. As they walked, Thomas kept talking, his voice low, but clear enough that those of us nearby could hear, his words meant for Jake. but carrying a lesson for anyone willing to listen. "Speed is a tool, son, nothing more than that," Thomas said. "It's what you do with it that matters. It's why you draw that gun that defines you, not how fast you draw it. I was fast once. Fastest in Kansas territory, they said. Fastest anyone had seen. But speed didn't make me a good marshal. Speed didn't keep the peace. Speed didn't make Abilene safe for decent folks to live and raise families." Jake was listening, really listening. In a way, he probably hadn't listened to anyone in years, his usual arrogance beaten out of him by pain and shock, and the sudden terrifying realization that he wasn't invincible. "What made you good?" Jake asked, his voice tight with pain but genuine in its curiosity. If it wasn't speed, what was it? Thomas was quiet for a moment as they walked, considering the question, maybe thinking back over all those years in Abilene, all those confrontations and conflicts and moments when everything hung on his choices. "Judgment," he finally said. "Patience, knowing when to draw and when to walk away, knowing how to talk to angry men, how to calm situations before they turned violent, knowing that every time I pulled my gun, even if it was justified, even if it was necessary, I was taking something from myself, losing another piece of whatever peace I might find someday." They reached Doc Harrison's office, and the doctor, who'd been watching from his window like everyone else, hurried to hold the door open. But before Thomas helped Jake inside, the younger man turned to look at the old marshal. Really look at him, seeing him maybe for the first time as something other than a target or a victim. "I've got 17 kills, Jake said quietly. All the pride and bravado gone from his voice, leaving just a statement of fact that suddenly sounded more like a confession. 17 men dead because they faced me, because I challenged them or they challenged me. 17 families who buried someone because of my gun." Thomas nodded slowly, his weathered face showing understanding and sympathy. "I know, son, and I've got more than that. 23 men over my 15 years as a marshal. 23 times I pulled this trigger. 23 times I watched a man fall. The justified ones and the questionable ones. The ones who gave me no choice. And the ones where maybe, if I'd been smarter or more patient or just luckier, I might have found another way." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with the weight of all those years. "All those ghosts. They all come back at night, son. Every single one of them. The justified ones don't haunt you any less than the others. Dead is dead, and you're the one who made them that way. And that follows you everywhere, every day, for the rest of your life. That's why you're still breathing right now. That's why I shot to wound instead of kill." Jake's eyes were wet, whether from pain or emotion or both. It was hard to tell. "Why?" Thomas smiled, but it was a sad smile. The smile of a man who knows too much and wishes he knew less. "Because you're young enough to learn, son. Young enough to change. Young enough to take what happened here today and become someone different, someone better. That's why I wounded you instead of killing you. To give you that chance." They went inside then, Doc Harrison taking over, helping Jake to a chair and starting to cut away the blood-soaked shirt to get at the wound underneath. And that, my friends, is the true story of the fastest gunslinger who challenged the old drifter for fun, and what happened next. I've told it just as I saw it, just as it happened on that dusty street in Razor's Bend, Arizona territory, back in the spring of 1877. I was there on that balcony above the Reza's Cava Saloon, watching with my own 2 eyes, and I saw every moment of what I've just described to you. Thomas Carver stayed in town just long enough to make sure Jake would survive. To sit with him while Doc Harrison cleaned and dressed the wound to make sure infection didn't set in during those first critical hours. Then, just as he'd said he would, he rode out the next morning, back on that tired paint horse, heading north again toward whatever peace he'd been trying to find before Jake Hollister forced him to be Thomas Carver, the legendary marshal one more time. As for Jake Hollister, well, his story had a different ending than anyone expected. He spent 3 months in Razor's Bend recovering from his wound, and during that time something changed in him. That cruel arrogance was gone, burned away by pain and shock and the terrible knowledge that he'd been beaten, that he wasn't invincible, that speed without wisdom is exactly what Thomas Carver said it was. Just noise before the silence. When Jake finally left town, his arm healed but still stiff, he didn't ride out looking for his next challenge, his next victim, his next addition to his reputation. Instead, he took a job as a deputy marshal down in Silver Creek, using his skills to protect people instead of terrorizing them, using his speed for good instead of for ego. I heard stories over the years about Deputy Jake Hollister, about how he'd changed, about how he talked men down from fights instead of forcing them into gunplay, about how he'd become the kind of lawman Thomas Carver had been in his prime. Some say Jake wrote to Thomas now and then, sending letters north to Montana Territory where the old marshal had finally settled on a small ranch, raising horses and living quiet. I don't know if that's true, but I like to think it is. I like to think that what happened in our little town that day created a connection between those two men, that Thomas's mercy created something good, saved not just Jake's life, but his soul. The lesson of this story is simple, but profound. Speed without wisdom is just noise before the silence. Real strength isn't about how fast you can draw or how many fights you've won. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. It's about using your power to protect instead of to destroy. It's about mercy when you have the ability to kill. About giving second chances when you have every right to end things permanently. Thank you for listening to this tale from Red Frontier, where we bring you true stories of the Old West. Until next time, ride safe. Finalmente, permíteme enviarte mi más profundo agradecimiento. Gracias por escuchar y por permitir que esta historia hable a tu corazón. El Viejo Oeste aún guarda verdades incontables. Unas dolorosas, otras tiernas, todas dignas de recordarse. Quédate con nosotros, suscríbete, comenta e invita a otros a descubrir estos relatos indomables. De nuestro corazón al tuyo. Gracias por ser parte de este camino. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. Cada historia compartida se produce con fines de entretenimiento narrativo. Algunas escenas pueden incluir elementos ficticios o dramatizados, inspirados en circunstancias históricas. Aunque las herramientas de IA nos apoyan en imágenes, narración y desarrollo de guión, el tono emocional, la edición y la calidad final pasan por supervisión humana para asegurar experiencias significativas. Cumplimos plenamente con las políticas de YouTube, sin recreaciones engañosas ni suplantaciones de personas reales. Todos los recursos creativos se encuentran debidamente licenciados. No se permite su copia, resubida o modificación sin autorización. Gracias por apoyar el esfuerzo detrás de cada episodio.